Welcome, everybody. My name's Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center here, the Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And I'd like to welcome you to this event, a talk by Michael Ross of UCLA on oil, Islam, and gender, a talk co-sponsored by the Government Department. Let me give Michael a brief introduction. He's an associate professor of political science at UCLA and chairman of the International Development Studies program there. He went to UCLA from Michigan, where he began his career, and before that received his PhD in politics from Princeton, which is where we met, and Samer and I and Michael met, and there's a whole Princeton cohort here. We try to keep it under wraps, but it comes out on occasions like this. Many of you, I think, are already familiar with some of Michael's research and publications, which explore the intersection of political economy, democratization, natural resources, and poverty in the developing world. In particular, Michael is a pioneering scholar on the resource curse. I was about to say the so-called resource curse, but I put it in quotes. The paradoxically poor performance of countries endowed with considerable natural resources. It's a growing literature, and Michael is really one of the trendsetters, one of the path-breaking scholars in this area. I just mentioned a couple of his publications, a review article in World Politics from a couple years back that helped to define the debate, and his book, Timber Booms and Institutional Breakdown in Southeast Asia, published with Cambridge University Press in 2001. As the title suggests, Michael's now particularly interested in oil and its effects, its adverse effects in different contexts. He's got a piece coming out on the topic of the talk today, Oil, Islam, and Gender. It's already come out, in fact, with the American Political Science Review, which is the flagship journal of our discipline. And he mentioned on the way in, he's got another piece called The Coming Oil Wars to be published in Foreign Affairs in the coming months. So, as we know from looking at the headlines, a very topical subject on many levels, the impact of natural resources, and very topical, I don't have to tell you, in the context of the relationship between oil, Islam, and gender. So with that, Michael, thanks for joining us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for coming. The question I'm going to explore today is, what is it that explains the relatively poor performance, the relatively slow advancement of women's rights in the Middle East? Traditionally, the common answer in the public discussion is that this has something to do with Islam. And I'm going to argue that Islam gets a bum rap here, that actually Islam plays little, if no role, in explaining the anomalous position of women in the Middle East, but rather oil is the key factor. And in fact, oil not only hurts opportunities for women in the Middle East, it has a similar effect on countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so forth. So I think the effect of oil on women's rights is an unexplored facet of the resource curse. So let me first give you the bare bones of the argument, and then I'll run through some of the evidence for you. The argument is based on three propositions, all of which are pretty well accepted within their own domain. The first one is that the entry of women into the labor force has far-reaching consequences in developing countries. And this is something that goes back to Frederick Engels and has been written about and studied for many, many years by many, many different scholars. When women begin to earn their own income, it affects all kinds of other things in society. Families decide to give their daughters better education and actually better health care because they know that they're going to be able to bring an income into the family. They're more likely to, women are more likely to delay the onset of their childbearing years. They marry at a later age, they begin reproduction at a later age, and so this affects the fertility rate. There's all kinds of studies, a wonderful study in Bangladesh of rural women working in factories showing that the experience of working in these factories and having their own income influences their whole sense of self-worth and their ability to bargain with men. And it has all kinds of subsequent consequences in their own family. So this is pretty well accepted. The second proposition, also pretty well accepted, is that in developing countries, the engine that brings women into the labor force is low-wage manufacturing, meaning sweatshops. Countries that have factories that produce textiles generally, garments, textiles, and other labor-intensive goods, are the countries that do the most effective job of bringing women into the labor force. And this also happens to be a very, often a very good step towards economic growth. This is, again, something that's not new. I mean, 100 years ago, the American garment industry was dominated by women. My ancestors, my female ancestors, worked in the garment industry in Manhattan in the early 20th century. And it's probably no coincidence that this boom in the garment industry in the US, again, overwhelmingly staffed by women, proceeded immediately and fed into the suffragist movement and the movement to give women the right to vote in this country. Okay, third proposition, also really, well understood and agreed to by people who look at this, is that countries that produce oil are unable to develop these low-wage manufacturing jobs, these sectors. It happens through an economic mechanism called the Dutch disease, and I can go into the details if you like, but the basic idea is simply that if you're exporting lots of oil, it's very it's no longer economically sensible for you to be producing garments and other things made out of lots of low-wage labor. It's much easier to just buy these things abroad and import them. And so the countries that have lots of oil don't have sweatshops. Countries with sweatshops generally don't have oil. This is something that nobody really seems to dispute. But when you put these three things together, it implies that oil reduces economic opportunities for women. Countries that have lots of oil are not going to have the same kind of job opportunities for women. And I'm going to take this one step further. Not only does having oil hurt economic opportunities, if women don't have those economic opportunities, I'm going to argue that it also hurts their political influence. And this goes back to a very long literature. My argument is based on a very long literature. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the work of E.P. Thompson and others who talk about the effects of having factories and factory work. In his classic work, The Making of the English Working Class, Thompson argues that the textile mills were the agent not only of industrial but also social revolution, producing not only more goods but also the labor movement itself. In other words, when people became factory workers, it had this revolutionary effect on their self-consciousness and their ability to work together and form organizations and fight for their rights. The same thing, I argue, is true for women today. And so I'm going to argue that oil also reduces the political influence of women. And I'm going to take it one step further still. And this is this final step is something that I didn't anticipate when I started this project. I wasn't looking at it, and in fact, the first time I talked about my research on this, I barely even mentioned it until somebody pointed out that this was kind of interesting. And that is that once you account for the role of oil and how oil affects women's rights, Islam no longer seems to make much of a difference in the rights of women when you examine it statistically. And I'll argue that also this kind of makes sense logically in case studies. So my argument ultimately is that oil and not Islam explains the slow progress of women in the Middle East and in many other parts of the world. Okay, now in order to try to convince you of my argument, I'm going to use 4 types of evidence. I'm going to first look at just countries within the Middle East. Then I'm going to do a statistical analysis looking at countries over time, over the last 40-some years, and see if changes in the amount of oil they have affects women's opportunities. And then I'm going to do a cross-national statistical analysis, and then I'm finally going to just talk about some cases, case studies in North Africa. And because I suspect that the statistical part is the most boring part, I'm going to rush over that. But if you would like to dwell on it, I'm happy to talk about it further. Let me first of all, though, just start by noting some of the obvious things that we already know about the anomalous position of women in the Middle East. First of all, if you cluster countries by region and look at how many women are part of the labor force, which is here on the y-axis, and then you look at how rich the regions are, income per capita, on the x-axis, you can plot all the different regions of the world. And generally speaking, as you know, social scientists have known for a long time, countries that are richer tend to have more women earning their own incomes, more women in the labor force. But look at the Middle East down here. The Middle East is the big outlier. For some reason, the Middle East, richer than all these other regions, still has by far fewer women in the labor force. If we look at women's political influence using another measure, we find that the Middle East is also an outlier. Now, the measure I'm going to use here, and I'm going to use it for the rest of the talk, is the fraction of the parliament, the fraction of parliamentary seats held by women. It's not a great measure of women's rights, but it's kind of a rough and ready measure, and we have this data available for a lot of countries, and so it gives us kind of a rough idea of how much women are getting elected and how much they have opportunities to advance gender equality issues. So again, parliamentary seats held by women here, income per capita here. Countries are clustered by region. In general, the wealthier you are, the more seats held by women, except in the Middle East, which is down here. Relatively wealthy, not many women who have representation in parliament. Okay, so that's the puzzle that I'm trying to address. And as I think everybody here knows, this is quite a significant public policy issue. There's several White House initiatives specifically on gender rights in the Middle East, specifically designed to promote women's rights. When Mrs. Bush was in the Middle East at the end of last year, she had various meetings with women's groups. When President Bush was there recently, he also met with the female representatives of civil society. It's very much on the minds of policymakers. And as you also know, it's very much sort of in the public policy discourse. And in particular, there are lots and lots of people who say Islam is bad for women. Islamic societies promote gender discrimination, and hence Islamic societies have these bad effects. In fact, there's some people who argue, in fact, some very eminent and thoughtful political scientists who claim that the clash of civilizations between Islam and the rest of the world is really about gender rights. Women don't have these rights in the Islamic world. Women do have these rights in the rest of the world, And this is what produces this, this great tension and all of the consequences. So, again, a big part of public policy discussion. Now, I mentioned I'm going to try to make my argument looking at these 4 types of evidence. Let me start out by looking at just the countries of the Middle East, okay? And the thing I want you to note is that there's just lots and lots of variation within the Middle East in the status of women. Anybody who knows the Middle East realizes this. This is a list of all the countries that are, according to the World Bank's definition of the Middle East, in the region, Middle East and North Africa, all overwhelmingly Islamic or primarily Islamic. This one column is the year that women got the right to vote. The second is legislative seats held by women. And the third is women in the labor force, okay? And the thing I just want you to note is that there's just lots of variation, okay? In some countries, women got the right to vote in the 40s. In others, they don't have it today. Legislative seats held by women in some countries higher than in the US, Tunisia. In other countries, it's 0. Again, women in the labor force, huge variation, okay? So if all of these are countries, or almost all of them countries that are overwhelmingly populated by Muslims, why is it that there's so much difference in the status of women? Well, I tried to take a first cut at this question by just using some scatter plots. And now I'm looking at different countries, and here on the y-axis I have the year that women were granted the right to vote, running from 1940 to 2008. And here I have basically oil and gas wealth per capita, going from 0 to $20,000 per capita. First thing you'll notice is that in countries with very little oil, women were granted the right to vote much earlier. And in countries with lots of oil wealth, they have, these countries were much more reluctant to grant women suffrage. And in fact, I include Saudi Arabia up here, even though women don't yet have the right to vote there. But if I didn't put it there, you wouldn't know where, that it was supposed to be up in that part of the graph. Also looking at women's participation in the labor force. Going from 0, almost no women working, to, well, 40% here at the top, but the highest country is Morocco, about 33%. Again, there's a strong relationship, okay? More oil, fewer women in the labor force. And similarly, there's a strong relationship between the amount of oil and women in parliament. Now you might think, well, this number of women in parliament really isn't a very good measure of women's rights, which is of course true. So I put together another figure which uses an index of women's rights in the Middle East, put together by 2 scholars, Nazir and Tompert, and plotted out their gender rights index. More rights up here, fewer rights down here, again, against the amount of oil that a country has. And again, there seems to be a pretty strong relationship between women's rights and the amount of oil. Okay. Well, now that's just in the Middle East, right? So you might say, this is just kind of some sort of anomaly, and it has something to do with all of the oil being concentrated in the Arabian Peninsula, and those countries have, special history. Maybe this doesn't really work anywhere else. But in fact, if you look around the world, it kind of does. So in Africa, for example, the country with the most oil wealth, Nigeria, has rather few women in parliament, where the mean country in the region has about 3 times as many. In Latin America, Venezuela, the big oil producer of Latin America, significantly fewer women in parliament than in the average country in the region. In the former USSR, same kind of thing. Even though, you know, communist states had this sort of strong tradition of promoting women in the labor force and women in government. And you even find it in East Asia. Malaysia is the country, actually happens to be a mostly Islamic country, is the country in East Asia that has the most oil and gas. And even though it's considered, and rightly, as a country where women's rights have been advanced through many initiatives, you still have fewer women in parliament there than you do in the average country in the region. Same, incidentally, true for Indonesia, another oil-producing country. Well, to explore this further, I ran a whole series of statistical tests, and I don't want to belabor them. I'll just describe them very briefly. Here I'm looking at all countries around the world, 167 countries, and I'm asking whether certain things are correlated with the number of women in parliament. Now, this doesn't really tell us, you know, if one thing is causing another, but it tells us, it can give us an idea if there's some sort of meaningful relationship. And the thing I want you to notice is that there are lots of different factors that seem to be linked to women's political participation in government. Islam is marginally correlated with the number of women in parliament. But once you control for oil, oil is very strongly related to the number of women in parliament. And once you add oil to the equation, Islam is no longer statistically significant. By Islam here, incidentally, I'm just measuring the fraction of the population that is self-professed Muslim. I carry out some additional, very esoteric statistical tests and find the same kind of thing, you know, chopping up the data in different ways, looking at it from different angles. Again, I can talk about it more if you like. But let me dwell finally, though, on my final bit of evidence before I open the floor up for discussion and questions. And here I'm going to just look at some countries in a set of mini case studies. The countries I want to focus on are the three Francophone countries, or rather former French colonies in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Okay. These countries are rather similar in a lot of ways. They achieved independence around the same time. Women were given the right to vote almost around the time of independence in all cases. Per capita income is pretty similar in all these countries. It's lower in Morocco, Algeria's in the middle, Tunisia's at the top, but they're pretty much in the same range. The big difference, though, is that Algeria has lots of oil. Lots of oil. Morocco has none, Tunisia just a tiny bit. And remember I said a few moments ago that if you've got oil, you can't have sweatshops, and vice versa. Let's just say, you know, if you've got oil, you can't have sweatshops. If you don't have oil, it doesn't mean you'll necessarily have sweatshops. But it turns out that if you measure just the textiles, the clothing exports per capita, Morocco and Tunisia actually have pretty vigorous textile industries. And as I'll explain in a moment, these are overwhelmingly places where women work. And Algeria has almost none. And consequently, you have quite a large number of women participating in the labor force in Morocco and Tunisia, and very few in Algeria, and many more women in parliament in Morocco and Tunisia than in Algeria. But let me see if I can tell a brief story about a couple of these countries that will try to explain these facts and put them in some sort of context. I'm going to focus on a comparison of Morocco and Algeria. lot of what I say about Morocco could be applied to Tunisia as well, but Tunisia's a little funny in that you had this sort of kind of top-down effort to promote women's rights very early on, and so that kind of makes it almost unfair to compare it. So let's just look at these two countries. Morocco, as I said, no oil. In the late 1960s, there was a deliberate effort by the government to start promoting the manufacture of clothing and fabric and to export these to Europe. It was actually initially an effort to try to reduce unemployment among men. But much to the government's surprise, the new factories recruited women. They actually went out and tried to find women willing to work in these factories. And by 1980, 75% of the workers in the export textile factories were women. Interestingly enough, those factories that still produced for domestic consumption were mostly staffed by men. It's the export sector that tends to be dominated by women. There's greater pressure to keep wages low. Often export-oriented factories are owned by foreign companies. They may operate by different norms. There's a number of other reasons why that may be so. By 2004, Morocco's biggest industry was the textiles industry. It had been a tremendous success. And it also had this effect of bringing large numbers of women into the labor force. 75% of the growth in the 1990s, 75% of the growth in female employment came solely from women getting jobs in textile factories. About the same time, we see a large growth in the number of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are dedicated to women's rights. There's an explosion of activity in civil society concerned with women's rights. For many years they campaigned without a whole lot of success. But in 1990 to 92, there was a remarkable petition campaign. Even though none of the political parties supported this petition campaign, Moroccan women were nonetheless able to collect over 1 million signatures and, in spite of the odds, press for the first reforms in Morocco's family laws. They had a great deal of met a great deal of opposition, and the battles went on throughout the 1990s and up to today. But they've had a whole series of significant victories nonetheless. In 2004, there were finally very significant reforms in the family laws. There have been significant labor reforms. Now it's women have legally at least equal rights in the workplace. A whole series of other reforms that are really quite impressive. In Algeria, you might think, if you didn't know that much about these countries, that women would be better off in Algeria than in Morocco. Okay? Public opinion surveys show that attitudes about women's rights are more conservative in Morocco than they are in Algeria. Algeria's wealthier, and wealthier countries tend to have more rights for women. And women, in fact, were part of the struggle for independence and played an important role in achieving independence from France. And so they were kind of in on the ground floor in the political system. And yet, many fewer women working, many fewer women in parliament today. I would argue that this has a lot to do with their failure to develop jobs for women, to give women economic opportunities to work. There was, interestingly, an effort in the 1990s to develop a textile sector, similar to what was so successful in Morocco and Tunisia. They had really no success whatsoever, and today they have really quite conservative family laws. some nominal reforms in recent years, but still generally women who work are limited to the sort of traditional occupations, school teacher, nurse, generally health and education or government work, rather than working in private sector jobs. And even though Algerian women's NGOs have made these heroic efforts, they still have constantly met opposition and just not made nearly the same kind of progress. Okay, and just to illustrate one or two points, Morocco. The red line here is exports from textiles going up, from 1965 to today, rather dramatically. The blue line is the amount of oil that they export, which is to say pretty much none. Algeria, you have the opposite situation. Okay, lots and lots of oil exports, and in fact today, with prices going up, that line is way up there again. But efforts to develop a textile sector have lagged considerably, and each time oil revenues go up, efforts to develop these sectors, just kind of collapse even further. Okay, let me just try to summarize my argument. I've been talking for about half an hour, and then say one or two things about the implications. So, I'm trying to argue that oil production is linked to lower female labor force participation, to having fewer female representatives, and that, at least statistically speaking, Islam seems to have no correlation with either of these measures once you account for the role of oil. And this implies to me that oil, not Islam, tends to reduce the status of women. Now let me say, finally, just what I think are a couple of possible implications of this argument. First of all, I think it can help us understand why the Middle East looks different from the rest of the world. This is kind of one of the enduring puzzles of comparative politics. There's just something different about the Middle East, and the countries aren't as democratic. Women have a different status. There's all kinds of social and economic and cultural differences. What explains it? I would argue that oil actually has a much larger role than we appreciate. And everything I've said here, incidentally, about the rights of women also applies to democracy. I've gone through, for other purposes, the data once again and found out that it looks like Islam tends to make countries less democratic until you account for the role of oil. And oil really explains this, the position of the Middle East countries, not Islam. A second implication is that some kinds of economic growth actually might hurt gender equality. We normally think in the social sciences, economic growth, good for women. As countries develop more opportunities, more rights for women, women have all kinds of new possibilities. That may only be true with certain kinds of economic growth. If economic growth is based on, say, the growth of industry and manufacturing, if it's based on the extractive sector, it might have the opposite effect. As I mentioned a couple of times, this is sort of a new dimension of the resource curse, a new facet of the complex set of problems and issues that oil-rich countries face and mineral-rich countries in general. And finally, I think it does have, or at least should have, some implications for foreign policy, for U.S. foreign policy, and certainly for how we think about the so-called clash of civilizations. Now, believe me, I don't want to grant that there is some sort of clash of civilizations out there, but if you think there is, I think it's important to consider whether this is really a clash of types of economies rather than types of cultures. Now, can something be done about this? Does this mean that if you are in an oil-rich country, and you are a woman, that, you know, pretty much you're out of luck. I think there's actually a lot to be said about that, and I'd be happy to elaborate, and maybe we can have some discussion about that. But I want to make a distinction, first of all, between two sets of oil producers. One, the long-time oil-producing countries, many of them in the Middle East. But second, there's a whole new set of countries now in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, that are all about to or just coming online, just recently have coming online as big oil and gas exporters. And they are about to face the exact same problems that have confronted countries in the Middle East and countries like Nigeria and Venezuela and Mexico. Maybe there are ways that we can gender-proof their economies and the process they are about to go through, and look for ways to promote special opportunities for women so that the good fortune of having lots of money from oil does not turn into a bad fortune of women left behind in so many economic and political ways. Okay, let me draw the line there and invite comments and questions. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions.
Could you introduce yourself too?
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm Alicia Lagat. I'm a student, NSFS student here, and and I was wondering, I don't really understand the oil production process, and would it be possible for governments to make a concentrated effort, the new oil suppliers, to make a concentrated effort to employ women perhaps in the oil sector? Could that be some opportunity for jobs for women?
Uh-huh.
And then the second question was, what was the situation for women's rights before oil was discovered in the existing oil suppliers? Was it equivalent to what was going on elsewhere in the world, or was that, did it start off sort of imbalanced?
Right. Okay. Okay. Two really good questions. So first of all, one of the problems with having lots of oil is that having the oil in itself doesn't really create many jobs, particularly if the oil is offshore, which is the case in a lot of the new, say, African producers and Southeast Asian producers. You essentially have a rig full of several hundred expatriates who come in, extract the stuff, and put it on a barge, leaving your waters, creating no jobs, and sometimes not even, touching your soil if you're a new oil-producing country. So there aren't even many jobs for men. But what tends to happen in oil-producing countries is that some sectors nonetheless boom, and other sectors shrink. The booming sectors tend to be construction and government employment. And construction, as we know, very few opportunities for women traditionally in construction. Government, kind of a mixed bag. But I think the trick is, and I think your instincts on this are pointing in the right direction. The trick is to figure out what kinds of industries, what kinds of businesses, what kinds of economic opportunities are going to grow anyway if you've got a lot of oil, and then figure out how to create special opportunities for women there. So your second question is a very not just a question, but a very sharp analytical point. And let me rephrase it to be even harsher in its criticism. Isn't it really silly to blame the status of women in, say, Saudi Arabia on oil, when before oil, women had, if anything, fewer rights? How can we say that oil is at fault? Okay. Here's one way to think about this. In the sort of pre-industrial era, let's say 100 years ago, women in the Middle East actually had more rights than women in East Asia. Okay? Women in countries like Korea, Japan, China probably were in the most dire situation of women in any part of the world, and certainly more than in Muslim countries in the Middle East, where, according to Islamic law, they have certain rights and certain access to property and certain family rights and so forth. Something happened in East Asia. Something changed. Okay? Today, women are actually accorded substantial rights and play a very large role in countries like, say, South Korea, where as recently as 1930, 90% of them were illiterate. I think that something is industrialization. Okay? Both regions have gotten wealthy, but the wealth brought along women and created new opportunities for women in Asia, but it didn't create opportunities for women in the Middle East. It didn't necessarily make them worse off, but they were not able to participate in all of the new empowerment opportunities that were available to men. So that's kind of the way I think about it. If you remove the Mideast dummy, then Islam does become more significant. And in the I tried in my talk to kind of put the strongest point forward, because what I really want to emphasize is that at least some of what we attribute to Islam is probably attributable really to oil and to economic forces. But if you you and I were talking together in the back room afterwards, I would be forced to admit that, sure, of course, there are many ways that Islam nonetheless matters. Part of the reason why the dummy variable for the Middle East is significant, I'm sure, has something to do with the fact that you have large Islamic populations here. Nonetheless, I would argue that the proper way to do this, to do the analysis, is to have them both in, and whether or not you include the Middle East dummy, you still find that oil has this very significant effect, and its presence reduces the effect of substantive effect of Islam. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Brendan Geary. I'm a PhD student in government department and a former student at the Arab Studies Center.
Oh, okay.
I sort of have a two-pronged question. One is to follow up on Professor Boutin's question, sort of the measure of Islam, which is basically measured by the percent of population.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. I'm sort of wondering if you were to generalize more about this and take it towards just religion in general and resource-rich states, how would you, are there certain, would you just measure population that's religious versus, or are there certain aspects within there, not treating the religion as monolithic in a sense that just because you claim to be of a religion that it's going to be sort of measured in that way in the regression analysis. And the other sort of question I had, getting at sort of the new dimensionism of the resource curves that you said, sort of gets at the rentier state theory and wondering how much this is part of a institutional argument and sort of the sequential / institutional part of that argument of the rentier state theory. If you were to look at a case such as Norway and seeing that where probably women in politics and women's rights are at a higher level perhaps because their oil wealth wasn't extracted until after their institutions were developed.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of interesting issues sort of wrapped up in particularly in the first part of your question. The simplest way to answer it is to say, I tried other variables for other religions, and no other religion variable was significantly associated with any of the outcomes, any of the women's rights outcomes. So hence we sort of focus on women. I don't know a way to measure, say, religiosity in general. But let me see if I can use that as an opportunity to make another point. A common retort to my argument, and it's usually like one of the first two questions because there's somebody really, just annoyed at what I'm saying. And so I'll make it easy for you guys and say it myself, is you're treating Islam as some sort of monolithic religious force. When anybody who knows Islam knows that there's tremendous variety and tremendous variation in practices and policies and interpretations, and how can you try to reduce it to this simple, silly variable? I am a social scientist, so I do, reduce things to silly variables. That's part of my job. The counter argument that I've just phrased usually says what really explains variations in the rights of women is variations in the type of Islam. Islam is quite different in Saudi Arabia than it is in, say, Morocco. And that's usually considered the end of the story. Okay? Differences in Islam explain differences in outcome in Islamic countries. See, to me, that's only the middle of the story, because I think we can actually explain variations in religiosity and explain variations in Islamic practices to some degree. There's a wonderful study by former UCLA graduate students, Lisa Blades and Drew Linzer, looking at survey data of women in Islamic countries, showing that women are more likely to have traditional views about gender roles if they don't have economic opportunities, if they don't have jobs, the opportunity to get a job. There's a strong association there. I think we can explain why strong religious forces persist in some societies into the year 2008, but they are diluted somehow, that is diluted, not diluted. They're diluted in other societies by economic forces, by the forces of industrialization, by empowering women economically, and hence beginning the erosion of patriarchal norms and ultimately patriarchal laws and policies. Where you don't have that economic process, then traditional forms of Islamic interpretation, like we see in Wahhabi Islam, are much more likely to persist. Okay. You can come back to me on that if that's implausible to you. Second part of your question, does this fit into sort of an institutional argument about the rentier state? Without getting too much into sort of the arcana of the literature, I think that's a good point. And I do, in fact, in the paper, make a very similar point that in countries that have high incomes, where women are already given full opportunities, oil doesn't take that away. And Norway is a great example. If women are given equal rights and equal opportunities to work in all economic sectors, then having oil isn't going to reduce that, because the parts of your economy that are going to boom are already open to women. Okay, government jobs, construction jobs, other service sector jobs. Those are already sort of desegregated. The labor market is not segmented that way. If you haven't gone through that process, though, if these occupations have not yet been opened up to women, then the opportunities will only boom for men or for migrant laborers. And you won't have this political empowerment. Okay. Yeah.
My name's Lisa Soto, and I'm just passing through. I'm a tourist.
Okay.
I came for the Cherry Blossom Festival and stayed. But my question is, can you think of any specific policy or application that one could use to encourage development of these other sectors? Through some program, perhaps some sort of parity in student visas between male and female. Something, I don't know. Can you suggest anything?
Yeah. Actually, that's a great suggestion, because one of the things that one of the ways you can spend your money, if you've got this sort of huge oil windfall, you can spend it without doing any special harm to your economy is by educating your people. And in particular, you can give them scholarships, and if you don't have very good universities, send them to other countries. And so that would be a great thing, you know, to make sure that there's some kind of gender parity there. You know, another thing that is just very simple is to try to promote better reporting and more transparency on who's getting employed. Some governments will simply not release or collect statistics on whether or not they're employing women. Simply forcing them to do that or encouraging them to do that could also encourage them to change their policies and create more opportunities for women. So the trick is to find, you know, you can't sort of go against, in my view, you know, the very powerful economic forces that happen when you've got all this oil wealth. But you can look for ways to exploit the opportunities that you're going to get. And so yes, I think that's, you know, one possibility. Another is to think of ways to especially expand jobs in the health sector, where women are often employed in significant numbers. Yeah.
My name is Yvonne from the Woodstock Theological Center at Georgetown University. I'm trying to look at almost the same arguments. I come from the Congo, Kinshasa, in Africa, and in my country for the moment, my country is one of the major destinations of private investors in mining.
Yeah.
So I would not look at oil, but mining,
Yep.
the mining sector.
Yeah.
And I've tried to look at the social, political, cultural, and religious aspects of gender in my own country. And I'm trying to extrapolate what you are trying to explain to us here. How is the level of education in the Middle East between men and women generally? And also, I don't know, do you have an idea about the structures of decision making generally in the society there in the Middle East? How does it look like?
Okay. Well, I can say something about the first, and I probably just don't know enough to say anything intelligent about the second. But let me say the first. For a long time, it's been true that fewer women are given an education in the Middle East than in comparable countries around the world. But that's actually a little bit deceptive. The countries in the Middle East have made faster gains than anywhere else in the world generally in educating women since about 1970. They've actually done a very good job of catching up from a position of very, very exceptionally low education levels before 1970. The funny thing is that with all of these gains in education, there hasn't been a commensurate gain in employment. You know, the traditional formula is educate them and then they will join the labor force and then, you know, the problem's over. There is a great increase in the supply of educated and qualified women in the Middle East. But there is very little demand for them economically. And hence, they haven't been moving into the workforce, and simply having an education but not having your own income, a paycheck that goes to you, and the opportunity probably also to work outside the home, to make connections with other people, to work outside your family unit and develop organizations with people of similar interests. Without those opportunities, I don't think you have the same political empowerment. So a relatively good story on education, but it hasn't yet produced so much because, in my view, of this problem with oil. In terms of the structure of decision making, boy, I think you'd probably have to speak to a genuine Middle East expert as opposed to an impersonator like me. Those of you who know me know I'm not a Middle East expert. I'm trained as a Southeast Asianist and just really trespassing here. I know that there's enormous variety, enormous variation, but I probably have to pass on that question. Let's see.
Two quick questions. One, Brendan halfway stole.
Okay.
My name is David Buckley. I'm a PhD candidate in the government department. And that's about the Islam measure also. Did you look at all, rather than at demographics, at institutional links between mosque and state, as it were? Or just, that's another measure that's out there that I know some people have been doing statistical work on. So just one.
I'm not sure. I guess I probably haven't seen that particular operationalized as a variable, but and it'd be interesting to look at that. I guess again, that's something that I think we can help explain. We can think of that as an outcome. As something that's influenced by, of course, by history and culture and lots of other things, but also influenced by economic forces.
And then the second quick question was just, you mentioned, I think in the Morocco case study, about how the textile companies that were set up for domestic consumption and owned, I assume, domestically, were less likely to employ women than the international companies that were set up for export. First part, could you just elaborate a little more on that? And might Islam and cultural practices be a part of the story there? Or what would be your story explaining that?
Well, there have been a number of studies of this, very, very interesting, with very, very interesting results. A number of very good studies in Turkey, another country with a large Muslim population, that finds the exact same thing. Even if you look within the same industry, even if you look within the same company, and you've got two factories, one exporting and one domestic producing, so you're even able to control for the ownership, you still find women much more likely to be employed in the export factory than in the domestic production factory. And the general explanation for this, not original to me, but that's established by economists, is that if you are exporting, you are competing with workers all around the world, right? So your factory has to use the absolutely most efficient, least expensive labor in your country. You have no margin for error. And women are, willing to work for less, or manipulated into working for less, but nonetheless will work for less. And they tend to be more reliable workers, according to a whole variety of labor studies. And so, perhaps it's the preference of some of these firms to, do the easy thing and hire men, but they're under great economic pressure to employ more women. And I think that's probably the case in the Moroccan story as well.
I'm wondering about whether there are particular outliers or cases that seem not to fit in any way, contradict the argument. And I haven't gone through the whole paper, but I noticed that you mentioned Egypt, Jordan, and Yemen as cases that might not fit for whatever reason. But what immediately struck me during the presentation were the cases of Iraq and Iran. Iran before the revolution, and Iraq, of course, before the recent kind of misadventure. In the sense that, and I don't have all the statistics, available, but Iraq was the country in the region that had the highest percentage of educated women, high percentage of women in the labor force, women were given full political rights, and so on. And then Iran, of course, also before the revolution, it's my understanding, that the Shah, despite his faults, was incredibly progressive with regard to women's rights. So I wonder if those cases
Yeah. Oh, good questions. Let me see if I can go back to some of the figures so we can have it up while we talk. Iraq and Iran. So women in the labor force. First of all, see, Iraq is here and Iran is here. So,
and this is 93 to 2002.
That's right. This is the average for that whole period.
Right.
So it's for Iran, it's obviously Islamic Republic, and for Iraq, it's pre-invasion. They're a little bit different, but not too different. I think people who have spent time in Iran, in particular, often say, actually women have a relatively advanced status in Iran. But often that's in comparison with, say, Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, or countries where women's status is so low that the comparison's a little bit unfair. So I even made a list of those countries around the world that are just as wealthy as Iran. And these include Morocco, Bulgaria, Ecuador, Albania. And then I looked at the status of women in these countries. And in all cases, many more women in parliament, many more women in the workforce. I think it is true that, nonetheless, that Iran is something of an outlier, and perhaps Iraq too. And my argument for why this might be so, to the extent that there is an anomaly, I wonder if it might not have something to do with the horrific costs of the Iran-Iraq war. My understanding is that so many young men died that the Islamic Republic, for example, was actually forced to give jobs to women, and women, became the main breadwinner for families that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. And so, in really in a sort of tragic way, this kind of opened the door, at least for a while. Iraq, Iraq is interesting. I mean, it's not uncommon that we find in Iraq, but also, of course, as you know far better than me, in Egypt and in Jordan and Syria, there will be, sort of a significant number of highly educated women, often in the professions. My view, my argument is that what matters politically most is getting sort of women in the working class into the public sphere, having their own incomes, and ultimately gaining political force through that process. Yeah.
My name is Yunus Mirza. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Arabic Islamic Studies. I actually spent a year in Berkeley University.
Oh.
So I just have three brief questions.
Yeah.
First one, how's your model taking into account expatriate workers?
Yeah.
So a lot of them are women, a lot of them are imported, and they do play a large role in the workforce.
Yeah.
The second one, in terms of women's rights, from my understanding, you're defining primarily economic and political rights.
That's right.
And people like Layla Abdul have defined women's agency as broader, that women do have agency outside of those sectors.
Uh-huh.
The third one, from my brief time in Berkeley University, I was actually had the opposite kind of concern that I had. It was really a crisis. I was really worried about the young men in Berkeley University, because all the university is really controlled by women. The president's a woman. The my dean was a woman. All the top students were women. I think only 30% of the student population were men. And there was a large problem when I was there in terms of Qatari youth, actually young men driving and getting into car accidents. Many of them were passing away. So the oil has actually created a culture of apathy for those young men.
Yeah.
So could we say, make it even broader, the oil maybe has certain effects on women, but also has effects on men in society? Yeah.
Good point. Well, let me deal with those in backwards order. as I say, I really know next to nothing about Qatar, and certainly absolutely nothing about Qatar University. It does fit with a little bit with what I was saying before about actually there being very significant investments in education for women. And yet it tends to be very restricted to certain sectors of the economy and hasn't created other economic opportunities. But that's very interesting, what you said about the university. The broader point that it affects men, absolutely. You're clearly right. I mean, it has a huge effect on employment opportunities and certainly the incentive to work. And on top of that, it has effects on, I think, on pressure for democracy and democratization. People are just less likely to demand accountability if they're going to get a check every month, and they get subsidies all across the board. It has all kinds of consequences, and including many that I don't fully understand, but I kind of think are there. The second point about a broader view of women's rights beyond economic rights and beyond political rights. I'm just curious if you could specify a little bit more about what that would be.
Yeah, that's a question I have.
Okay, all right, all right. Well, I unfortunately don't really know. Yeah, this is kind of my first foray into the investigation of women's rights, and I'm not as well schooled as I probably should be on some theoretical issues. Migrant labor, yeah. So, yes, clearly, very large numbers of migrant workers, and many of them women. My concern is that having, this huge migrant labor force of women who are willing to work at very low wages tends to even further reduce the opportunities for women and the incentive for female citizens to become part of the economy, and hence even further kind of removes these opportunities for political empowerment. I don't think it's simply empowering to have more women working in simply working if those women are not are specifically foreign workers and hence disenfranchised. But yes, clearly they play a very large role in these economies, and particularly the smallest of the states. Yeah.
My name is Rachel. My friend in terms of the education, you speak about how with all the oil, there's a big investment in education for women, but is that across the board throughout the Middle East, like even in the countries that don't have huge oil coming in, huge oil money coming in? And after the women go through the education and don't have jobs at the end, after that first class graduated, was there a huge drop off in attendance because they realized that there were no opportunities for them afterwards?
Those are really good questions, and they take me to the very frontier of those few things that I know about this issue. The figures I looked at generally are sort of aggregated across the countries in the Middle East. So I don't really know, actually. I know that many of the oil-rich countries certainly have invested a lot in women's education, and I don't know how much that's true in other countries as well. Just from the descriptions I've read, I get the impression that it's happening in most of the countries, but I don't really know for sure. And I don't think we've gotten to that point where women, having gotten advanced degrees and realizing that they don't have jobs, then tell their daughters or younger sisters to just stay home. At least the figures show continuing and very fast increases in the number of, for example, in female enrollment in primary and secondary schools. So that's continuing to rise, but it hasn't yet brought about the economic changes that we might like to see. Yeah.
My name is Anu Sudeep. I'm a this government department. I actually had a question. I mean, you talk a lot about political rights and the importance of manufacturing labor as a way of acquiring political voice. But how meaningful is it to talk about political rights or participation in parliament in countries in which parliament may not be the main vehicle of political will or decision making, for instance, in a country, or where the vast majority of people, men and women, don't have extensive political rights. There are struggles for political rights going on, but they don't enjoy them right now. So I guess if women did get involved in manufacturing in an environment where there is, where that additional step mechanism is not available, would that result in increased women's rights, or is democracy and democratization some sort a necessary step for that last leap of your argument to take place?
I think that's a very, very good point. And I think you really politely phrased it as a question, but really either meant it, or at least it stands on its own as an observation, that that it's simply getting seats in Parliament is only part of the story, right? If that Parliament is only an advisory body, then that means less than if it were truly a lawmaking body. Nonetheless, I think it's still significant. And if I were, if I were in a non-democratic country and a concerned woman, I would still feel better knowing that a lot of women had been elected to Parliament. And there are even studies, sort of micro studies. Eva Bellin did a nice piece on Egypt. There's showing that even in really non-democratic states, the fact that you have female legislators does seem to make a difference. They do really seem to concentrate on advancing gender rights issues. So it's maybe not be sufficient, but I think it is a first step.
One more question?
Yeah.
Christine Moran, also in the government department.
I'm sorry, I just didn't catch that.
Government department as well.
Okay.
I'd like to push you more on the policy implications because of the absence of this dynamic of women getting wages and demanding more political rights in those rich countries. Let's say perhaps Saudi Arabia. How do you incentivize governments who already have a very conservative role, a conservative stance on the women's role? How do you incentivize them to take into a broader account, more women's rights? Because there's already this feed into a full, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a really good point. Well, there's a variety of groups, including the World Bank, but also there's a forum of, I believe, of Arab economists. A number of organizations that have thought about this, and I think the short answer is that that even if you have governments that are not very friendly towards women's rights, they may still be interested in bringing women into the economy or using this as a resource, as a way to help develop. So there have been a number of reports recently that that emphasize that women are this tremendous untapped resource in a lot of Middle Eastern economies, and trying to encourage governments to think about ways to take advantage of this resource. Now, I happen to think, and I've argued, that once they get these economic opportunities, ultimately this will have an effect on patriarchal norms and they'll have political opportunities. But let's not talk about that right now. Maybe that's not, maybe that's not the message that we should be putting out there. Maybe we should just be trying to help governments think about how to take advantage of this this half the population that is otherwise excluded.
But then, that's sort of where ideology and Islamic values sort of come into a huge effect, right? Because
Yes.
then, populist beliefs of the role of women
Yeah.
Common to.
Yeah. Well, you're inescapably correct, which is why you know, and I don't have any answers, any easy answers, but I do think that there are more policy opportunities for making a difference in the new oil-producing states, where you don't have these kind of solidified norms and laws, where these economic forces really haven't yet taken hold, and that's maybe where, you know, policymakers should be putting you know, international policy thinkers like yourself should be focusing in the, you know, the Cambodia, Vietnam, East Timor, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, Kazakhstan, you know, Azerbaijan. I mean, there's a very long list of countries where this kind of phenomena is quite possibly about to happen, and where interventions maybe could make a difference.
Well, this has been a great presentation and a great conversation. We could go on. I'd like to thank you all for coming out this afternoon at a very busy time during the semester, and ask you to please join me in thanking Michael for sharing his thoughts with us.